Hello, you're welcome to The Inside. I am Bable Jonathan. Thanks for joining us on this edition of the program. We are broadcasting from Cameroon's economic capital, Douala. The World Health Organization warns that the coronavirus is now spreading at an accelerated rate. The organization says institutions need to review their approach if they hope to contain the virus. It has appointed an independent panel to give what it calls an honest assessment of the global response to the pandemic. In the meantime, the research on the coronavirus cure and the vaccine is well on course, and there is a growing fear of the possible devastating consequences of the use of the coronavirus pandemic in Black Africa. We're going to be talking about this in this edition of the program. Meet our guest in some few seconds. Our guest today, Professor Henry FOMUNDAM, is joining us from South Africa. Professor Henry FOMUNDAM is a pharmaceutical and public health expert who has been working in the areas of academia and public health programs in many African countries for several years. He served as a member of the National Clinical Trials Committee at the Medicine Regulatory Authority in South Africa for over 6 years, and as main consultant at the South Africa Development Community to review the capacity of medicine regulators in all 15 member states. He was part of the planning team to design one of the largest HIV clinical trials in South Africa, and for over 20 years, Professor FOMUNDAM has been involved in the management of several HIV projects, both in Africa and the United States of America. Professor, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
The World Health Organization says that the coronavirus is now spreading at an accelerated speed or rate. How fast is the virus spreading now?
Well, it's spreading a lot more than all the projections that WHO, CDC, all the agencies that are involved with epidemics and pandemics had. And so it's putting everybody on the line and making everybody very anxious. And so you could see globally we're over 13 million. When it started in March, nobody anticipated that this was going to go even beyond 2 million globally, but we're at 13 million. So the spread is definitely a lot more than anybody thought about it, to the point where everybody is now very challenged.
And the World Health Organization thinks that institutions have to review their approach in the fight against coronavirus if they hope to contain the virus. What should be reviewed in the response to the coronavirus at the level of institutions, countries, and so on?
So it's very critical that at this moment we do not have a proper treatment. What we do now is just supportive treatment. We do not have a vaccine at this time. And so what needs to be reviewed, the focus is on prevention. And prevention is going to become challenging because the projections have now gone way off the number that people thought. And so that's actually a thought process that they may have to look at deeply how this virus is actually transmitted. That it may be a lot more than what we're thinking. There's a school of thought that is coming out to say perhaps the virus is actually airborne, it lasts in the air longer than we thought, and that while we continue with the mask, it's proper that the masks are going to be staying on longer, because if the virus is going to stay in the air much longer than we thought, it means that just walking on the street, even if you're alone, you should actually have your mask on. And so these are some of the challenges that we're going to that the special committee that has been put together is going to be taking through this. So we will not be surprised if some more stringent measures come in terms of how we manage our personal spaces.
Just like Cameroon in Central Africa, South Africa is topping the chart as far as the number of coronavirus cases or persons tested positive for coronavirus is concerned in Africa. What explains that?
Well, first thing is South Africa has about over 250 something thousand cases. And like you said, in the Southern African region, in the SADC region, they lead. Cameroon in the CEMAC region is getting close to 15,000 cases. In the case of South Africa, the first thing is that South Africa has good surveillance systems, which means the reporting it's very, very good. It's not perfect, but it's definitely much better than you see with other countries. And in the CEMAC region, I'm almost sure that Cameroon has better surveillance than you find in all the other CEMAC countries. And so the reporting is probably better than you find in other CEMAC countries. So generally speaking, most of the African countries are definitely underreporting. And I would think even the reporting for Cameroon needs to improve. And I've said before that this is a situation where if the number of cases go up, we should actually be celebrating, because it's telling us that we're tracing better, because it is showing from what we see in Europe, in the US, that in Africa, we probably are not reporting as much. This is this problem that we saw when HIV started, that African surveillance systems were not picking up the cases until 5-10 years down the road, we became the highest continent with HIV. I think we should use this opportunity in Africa to strengthen surveillance.
You said if the number of persons tested positive for coronavirus is going up, we should be celebrating. Can you explain that a little more?
Well, we should be celebrating in the sense that I think currently almost all the African countries are underreporting. That's why you see very low numbers in Africa. And it's probably because of the infrastructural problems that we have. And so we need to be able to double the efforts to say, in the villages, we have to go right to the villages and be able to make sure that we have a proper reporting, documenting and reporting system, which is what we call a surveillance system. Because you would imagine that in some far-off village, in Kambe, in Kuseri, in any other remote area or enclave area in Cameroon, if somebody has COVID, and even the diagnosis is going to be a problem, the documentation is going to be a problem, the reporting is going to be a problem. And so those cases are going to be missed, and so you would find that in many African countries. That's why I say if the reporting is going up, it means that we're doing a better job at identifying and tracing the cases, and so we should celebrate. What we don't want is the number of cases that are dying, which is one person is one too many. But I've also seen that the recovery rate in Cameroon is very, very high. I mean, there's something that maybe we need to take a closer look to see why the recovery rate in Cameroon is extremely high. That's positive, but we need to find out how and why and the accuracy of it.
And the coronavirus continues making its way from the urban centers into the hinterlands. The Ndonga-Mantum division, for example, in the northwest region of the country, has recorded its first case of coronavirus. Why is it that all the measures that have been taken are unable to stop the virus from moving into the hinterlands?
Well, because I mean, it's one country, so people would move. If somebody came from Ndonga-Mantum to Yaoundé to Douala, and the person is obviously going to go back to their families. And the testing, the identifying, the symptoms, the prevention, these are things that we need to continue to preach, because once it gets into the hinterland, where we think the people are not as astute in terms of understanding the prevention. The people don't have enough mass. They still have the traditional funerals that they go to. They still have the traditional family meetings that they go to. This is actually a dangerous area for us, that when it begins to get into the hinterland, then we are going to face a major problem, because these are people that live within the cultural norms, the funerals that take place, and people live in close proximity when they get to funerals. It's part of the culture. So it's going to be difficult. And so that's one of the fears that we've always had with African countries, that when it gets into the rural areas, we're going to face these major challenges.
Now, globally speaking, the World Health Organization has created an independent panel to give what it calls an honest assessment of the global response to the coronavirus pandemic. What is your take on that initiative by the World Health Organization?
I think it's just a welcome initiative. I think, in other words, what WHO is actually saying is that the current staff that they have, they need help, and definitely they do. They may call it an independent organization, but we know that the leading surveillance organization that we have global is the US CDC. And so when they talk about it, it means that they're going to be asking help from CDC and other research organizations that are based in Europe to be able to come together to be able to do a proper analysis of what is going on, because this is going to be beyond WHO. WHO is actually very dependent on donor funds, and a lot of the member states that give money to WHO don't always meet their quotas. And so they usually always cash strapped. And so some of the ideas and interventions that they would like to do, they usually don't get to do them. And so you get to a point where at this stage, they're actually saying, we need help, we need more assistance, both technical help and financial assistance. And I think the idea of technical assistance, it's well deserved. They need to get to it now, and they need to make sure that we can put in more stringent prevention measures, because the clinical trials are still going on, and that's the challenge that we'll face globally.
All right. Is the creation of that panel signal that things are going to change as far as the management of the pandemic is concerned?
Well, yes. It is signaling two important things. It's signaling that the projections is way beyond what they thought. It's signaling that they need assistance, and it's signaling that we need a new approach. And so those are the three things. And so when a new panel is constituted, they're going to look at reality. They're going to learn from some of the experiences that they've had. They're going to learn from countries like China with their.
So how far has research gone on the coronavirus cure and vaccine?
Okay, let's try to differentiate a few things. There's treatment, which has a lot of clinical trials that are going on possible treatment. What they had hoped for was that some of the existing medications that they have could be repurposed for COVID-19. And so there are a lot of those ones that are going on. But for a cure, which most likely a vaccine would be what we're looking for, there are about 200 candidates, vaccine candidates, that are existing, and 15 of them are in human trials right now, and just a couple of them are in the last phase, which is phase 3 of the trial, which is probably going to go to the end of the year. And so we're very hopeful, but let me just say, a lot of times vaccine trials they're very challenging trials, particularly for a virus. And so the success rates for vaccine trials is actually less than 10% generally. So we're hoping that some of these ones can actually come through, particularly because we have at least 2 of them that are in phase 3. So we're looking forward to that. So we're very hopeful about a vaccine, and that some of the medications that can be repurposed. Some of them are HIV medications that are on trial right now to see if it's going to have benefit for the COVID-19.
Right. The National Institute of Health has launched a clinical trials network to test COVID-19 vaccines and other prevention tools. What do we know about this so far?
Well, that is something that institutions usually do. The network is so that they're able to monitor, to be able to facilitate, to be able to assist some of the pharmaceutical industries or academic institutions that are carrying on research on that. So that's a coordinated effort, and they're trying to do it to also include globally, so that they can keep tab and be able to understand where each and every person is, and also to assist them so that we don't come to the end of a trial and then we discover that some of the data that was collected was not accurate, or some of the claims that we made. Remember earlier on during the beginning of COVID, everybody spoke about hydroxychloroquine, and then later on we found out that the way the study was conducted, it wasn't in a manner that could be conclusive if hydroxychloroquine was working. And they had to reenact that, they had to quickly come back and said that was not a very high possibility at the moment. But there's still a number of studies that have now been properly designed to make sure that they can actually answer the question definitively this time if hydroxychloroquine is going to be active. So when you see the NIH come up with a network, that's the purpose of it, to make sure that they keep track of everything that is going on and be able to assist where assistance is needed.
Professor Henry FOMUNDAM, you are a Cameroonian, you are an African public health expert. Where is Africa in the search for the cure or the vaccine for coronavirus? Where are the African scientists?
Well, there are lots of very qualified African scientists in their own right. A lot of them are actually practicing and researching out of Africa. The reason is because in a lot of the European countries, in the US and countries like in Australia, they give them a research proper platform where they're able to conduct proper research. But for those who are on the continent, South Africa is the country that has that kind of infrastructure in terms of how you're able to conduct research. There are a number of steps that are required when you are conducting a research such as a vaccine research. The rest of the African countries, they have a lot of very good scientists, but some of them don't have the infrastructure and they don't have the leadership. Infrastructure would mean you have a proper laboratory service, you have the funding, you have the atmosphere to be able to collaborate with your international partners in different countries. That's actually what makes research. And South Africa has that kind of infrastructure. That's why they are the most advanced on the continent as far as a vaccine trial is concerned. In fact, on the 23rd of June, that's when they started enrolling for a vaccine trial in South Africa.
And how far has that gone?
They just started enrolling patients on the 23rd of June. So we are still to know exactly what is going to be the outcome. But given the way research is conducted in South Africa, we're going to have preliminary analysis, and that's probably going to be reported as whether we're making progress or not.
Professor, can we know a little more about the steps? Earlier you talked about the steps that should be taken in scientific research of this nature, the research for a vaccine or cure for infectious diseases like COVID-19. What are some of those steps?
Well, the steps that are usually taken in any clinical trial, including that of the vaccine, is that you have what you call preclinical trials. Preclinical trials is when you test the molecules on animals. And so we have various types of animals that are available for you to test, depending on the study that you want to do. It could be dogs, it could be chimpanzees, it could be pigs, or guinea pigs for that matter. And so that is called a preclinical trial. And the data from the preclinical research is usually put together so that you can then report it to the regulatory authority. Now, the regulatory authority will take that information and review it, and if there's enough safety data and there's enough information that says this medication is most likely going to work for a particular condition, then that's when you upgrade it and you get permission to now do what we call a clinical trial, which is now done in humans. And in humans, there are 3 phases. The very first phase that you do is going to be on healthy humans. The only thing you're trying to test there is that, is this molecule that I'm giving, what does it do when you give it to a human being, for example? How does it work? If it's an injectable, you want to make sure that, is it safe to inject into a human? How long does it circulate through the body before it gets eliminated? How does it get eliminated? What does it do to the kidney? What does it do to the liver? Now that's what you do at the level of phase 1. So you just want to know, they call it pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. Those are the terminologies that you use for the medication. In phase 2 of the clinical trial, it's usually divided into 2. It's phase 2A and phase 2B. Phase 2A is when you do a proof of concept. Proof of concept means you've gotten the patients of interest and you want to find out, is there any benefit at all to the patient? That's what you do, proof of concept in phase 2A. Phase 2B is when you start playing with the doses to say, what if I double the doses? Do I get double the benefit? If I triple the doses, do I get triple the benefit? And what are the adverse drug reactions? What are the side effects that I get? So that's when you know in phase 2B. When you get that, which is the proof of concept and the dose escalation, the third phase is now you open up to the large pool of patients. Usually it could be about 3,000 patients, 5,000 patients, but it's a higher number of patients that you use to now determine a number of factors. We look at how effective at the dose that you would have determined at phase 2B, and how effective is it in a large population. And when it becomes available, now you can now register the product, which means you submit the dossier of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 to your regulatory authority, who now reviews it and says, from what you have submitted, it shows that there's benefit to the patient. It shows that the drug is safe and the patients can use it. And so in cases like COVID, if we have just maybe 30% benefit because we're in a desperate situation, the regulatory authority would say, okay, we're going to approve it based on some peculiarities. It could be, say, we're going to give it to just the patients that are very critical on a ventilator, for example, and so we then subject you to a phase 4. Phase 4 is called post-marketing, which means while we have approved the drug, we want you to use it carefully and monitor and still give us data, even though we have approved the drug. So you could, in principle, have up to 4 phases. And so we now have a few of them that are in, just a couple of vaccine trials that are in phase 3, but we have a number of medications that are in phase 2, that's tablets and capsules that are in phase 2. So we're hoping that by early next year, we may be very hopeful that something may come out.
All right, Professor, we're going to take a look at what the newspapers reported this week in Cameroon. And when we come back, we'll talk about the fears of Africans with regards to the coronavirus vaccine. The press review by Makudit Fogwe.
According to The Voice, stray bullet kills nursing murder in a separatist and military shootout. The Reporter, The Scoop, The Sun and The Median report about the holding of peace talks between detained separatist leaders and the government of Cameroon. The Chronicle Times, Cardinal Tuni backs talks between detained separatist leaders and the government of Cameroon. The Median describes the demands made by separatist leaders during the ceasefire talks as tough. The Guardian Post questions who is afraid of dialogue between the government and separatist leaders. Another edition of the Guardian Post questions whose truth is true as government denies negotiating with separatist leaders. Eden, Minister Paul Tassong, coordinator of the Presidential Plan for the Reconstruction and Development of the Northwest and Southwest regions, says whether gunshots or not, reconstruction must go on. The Herald Tribune says at least 12 students test positive for COVID-19 in Catholic schools in Bamenda. The Guardian Post reports the death of Professor Victor Banlilong, a prominent Anglophone varsity don. The Post Weekender describes the tense atmosphere between taxi drivers and police officers witnessed in Boya, halting circulation for several hours.
Thanks, Immaculate Fogwe, for the press review. Professor Henry FOMUNDAM, a pharmaceutical care and public health expert joining us from South Africa, is still with us. Professor, there is a growing fear among Africans, notably sub-Saharan Africans, with regards to the coronavirus pandemic. Where is the problem?
Well, the problem is what everybody fears. Even those of us that work in the public sector, public health milieu, we are afraid because the projections that we made, it's way more than this. The mortality is there, and the fact that it takes a couple of weeks for some of the people that we've seen that have passed on, that died because of COVID, they die within a couple of weeks of contracting the disease. And so that normally would make everybody anxious. Now, but particularly in the African context, it's medications usually arrive on this continent last, and that's because of affordability. This is a continent that has so much yet very little, in the sense that if medications are produced, most of what is going to be used on this continent is going to be by way of donations. Because most of the African countries in their health care budget usually do not have enough to be able to afford. Just like we see with HIV/AIDS, most of the funding that we have for HIV/AIDS on this continent is not from the African countries. It's from donor funds, it's from the US, it's from the Global Fund, it's from a number of other countries. And so that's something that everybody in Africa will be worried about. Are the medications going to be available? That's one. But the second thing that is more concerning, which I'm hoping that we can talk about it, is the fact that, if there's a vaccine trial, are Africans going to be enrolled into the study, and what does that mean to them? And there's been a lot that has been spoken about that. We can have that discussion.
Exactly, Professor. That is an area which has been attracting a lot of reactions with regards to the vaccine trials and the possible devastating consequences. Is it a problem trying enrolling Africans in the vaccine trials?
Yes, it is a problem for a number of reasons. It's very historic that black people have had a short end when it came to clinical trials. But these are things that happened many years ago. The clear-cut one, which everybody makes reference to it, is the fact that in the early 1930s, there was a trial in Tuskegee in Alabama in the US, whereby black people were enrolled onto a syphilis trial. There were about 413 black people that were enrolled in that study that was supposed to last for 6 months, for six weeks to 6 months. It actually took about 40 years. What they did in that study was to get patients that had syphilis, they're black patients, and did not put them on any treatment, and didn't tell them the truth about what they were getting, didn't tell them the truth about what they were doing. And so a lot of those patients ended up dying or transmitted the syphilis to their spouses or to their vertical transmission, which means those that got pregnant were transmitted it to their newborn children. And so this has kept a very bitter taste for black people globally. And of course, what we can also cite is the fact that in Germany, during the Nazi period in Nuremberg, there were a lot of prisoners that were used for all kinds of studies that you could tell. And in nowadays, that's very, very illegal. And we now have ways that clinical studies are being conducted. And so people are very concerned that are they going to repeat the same thing? Historically, we've heard about that, but those of us that work in public health are saying there are a lot of declarations, a lot of guidelines, a lot of international guidelines, not only from WHO, from ICH, from SIOMS, from a lot of international guidelines that are putting together how clinical trials should be conducted. Now, this is what I must say, which takes very important note, that the way clinical trials are conducted nowadays requires that, if we take Cameroon as an example, Cameroon needs to have a scientific committee that looks at all the protocols that come into the country to look at what is the science on this protocol to test these medications on Cameroonians. That's a scientific committee that should be a standing committee at the Ministry of Health, at the Medicine Regulatory Authority. Then you have what you call the Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee looks at how are the patients selected, how are the patients protected. So the Ethics Committee is meant to make sure that there is no harm that is going to be done to the patients. It's meant to ensure that you are not coercing the patient, which means you don't pay them to come and participate just because you want to test medicine on them. That's what you call the Ethics Committee, and a number of things that they will have to do. Then you have a situation where the scientific committee and the regulatory authority has to make sure that any clinical trial or vaccine trial must have monitoring, must have a team that does regular monitoring to make sure that the patients are well protected. And then finally, there must be a team that looks at, are there any adverse reactions? Are there any side effects? So if each and every African country has this, then we shouldn't worry too much about what the vaccine is going to do. Bring it to Cameroon, to South Africa, to Nigeria. I know South Africa has it. So if you want to partner with South Africa, you have to go through those steps. And so the onus is on every African country to be structured in that manner. Now, there's a lot of gain for us to be able to participate in studies. Reason being that drug molecules act differently in different people. There are some medications that work differently in Caucasian population and the white population than it would work in the black population. So we should not wait to be tested only on Europeans and Americans and then we extrapolate, because it usually doesn't work in that manner.
Professor, how high are the risk of health complications or even death that could emerge as a result of such a scientific exercise, the vaccine trials?
Oh, very, very highly plausible. Very extremely highly plausible. Now, I've explained to you the process that a molecule is tested on animals first before it gets tested on humans. But humans are not exactly animals. There are some reactions that you may not see in the animals that you see on humans. And so that's very important. This process is actually called pharmacovigilance. It's a process where you monitor the side effects or the adverse drug reactions that may occur when somebody is taking medications either as part of a clinical trial or as part of therapy. And so there are situations where, yes, during a clinical trial, some patients may die. Now, and it's not only during clinical trials. There are medications that have been approved and patients are taking it and they die of the medication. So we must have a pharmacovigilance process in place where we're monitoring, even for new drugs that have been approved. Because remember, I told you that a drug can come into the market after having been tested only on 1,000 people, on 3,000 people. It therefore means that if there are some rare side effects, remember, if a drug is approved based on 3,000 patients, and you have a side effect that occurs 1 in 5,000 patients, it means that there's a high chance that you're going to miss it. And so it's very important that during the clinical trial, and even when the drug becomes available, our regulatory authority in Yaoundé, for example, in the Ministry of Health, must be very active. They must set it up. They must have the expertise to make sure that they can monitor for any side effects and report them. And if you see that a number of patients, 1, 2 patients have died during the clinical trial, it's up to you to be able to now notify the sponsor of the study. If it's a multi-country study originating from the US or somewhere, you have to quickly notify them to say, this is what we're seeing, and we're not happy with this. That way, the study can be stopped prematurely. We have clinical trials that have been stopped prematurely because of that system that is the monitoring, the therapy, and making sure that they don't have any adverse reaction that are very detrimental.
Are there racial factors that could influence the choice of people to be enrolled in vaccine trial, and the impact or the what could emerge from the trials in terms of health complications and even death? Racial factors, do they influence these?
Well, yes, they are, and that is what is called pharmacogenetics or pharmacogenomics, which means the gene, we have different genetic makeup. Even on a continent like this, people in the southern African countries have a different genetic makeup from our brothers in the Mediterranean area. There are some medications that are going to act a little bit differently when you take them because of the genetic makeup. And that's why we're saying, if you have a proper structure in place, we shouldn't be worried about bringing a new drug to the continent. We shouldn't be worried about bringing a new drug to Cameroon. You need to have that scientific committee in place. You need to have an ethics committee in place. You need to have a data safety monitoring board in place, which means they monitor all the safety of any study that is going. And then you need to have a study monitor committee in place, which means they're monitoring the study as it's going along. They're monitoring it on a regular basis. If you have all of that in place, there's no need to be afraid of what is going to happen because you have the proper checks and balances. So the onus is on the African countries, I say it again, for them to be able to set up in a manner that any new drug that they're bringing and want to test it in Africa, it has to go through them. Because it's not a matter of you calling some minister or calling the president of a country to say, we want to test a drug. That's not how it is done. If it's done that way, it's criminal. And of course, the regulatory authority in the US, the FDA, is not going to accept data like that. Or even to know that when you are giving the drug to a patient has to understand that what they're getting into it, which is what the ethics committee would do, they call it the informed consent. You have to explain to the patient that we're enrolling you on a clinical trial for this reason. And explain in a language that the patient would understand. I would understand if you're taking a study to Bamenda, for example, the explanation should not be done in English. You should do it in Pidgin, so that everybody who enrolls in the study understands why they're getting into it. And they should also know that they can ask any question anytime. They can drop out of the study anytime that they want. So, and then they should not be paid for participating in the study. The only thing that you give them is compensation if they have to pay transport to come to the hospital, or they have to buy food when they're in the hospital. All of these things are the way clinical trials are conducted properly. So people should not be concerned. What you should be concerned is telling your government that you should have all these committees in place so that we also have the experience of a new drug that is being tested in Europe and in America. We should be part of it. So it should be a multi-country study where it is not tested only on Africans, it's tested everywhere. And these committees have to be in place.
All right. We're going to talk more about that in a short while. Interviews of the week coming up next.
The socio-political crisis in the administrative regions of the Northwest and Southwest region triggered in 2016 as a result of corporatist demands of teachers and lawyers has since 2017 witnessed a constant radicalization on the part of armed gangs claiming to be a secessionist movement. To raise their complaints, these criminal terrorist gangs have engaged in the daily practice of atrocities in the two regions, as well as in neighboring communities. Abductions, beheadings, and extrajudicial killings of personnel, including the elderly, women, school children, or personnel of the defense and security forces deemed unfavorable to their project, has been their modus operandi. The case of Florence Ayafo, a wardress who was gruesomely murdered and beheaded on September 29, 2019, and the macabre video of her execution celebrated on social media by secessionist terrorists and their supporters confirmed the inhuman and beastly character of these secessionist terrorists. Nearly a year after the crime, two suspects formerly recognized on the video were recently arrested by the Defense and Security Forces. Their presentation to the national media today, Friday, July 10, 2020, aims at reassuring national and international opinion on the determination of the Defense and Security Forces to repress criminal gangs. The first two suspects in the murder of Florence Eyafor presented today had already been formally identified in the video that circulated on social media displaying her killing. Intelligence provided by local sources led to the arrest of Niba Innocent Akuma. Former investigations carried out by detectives of the Division of Military Security paved the way to track down his accomplice, Ngu Roger, on the night of June 24, 2020 at Ndobo Bonaberi in the city of Douala. At the time of his arrest, Ngu Roger was concluding a clandestine operation in the procurement of arms and ammunition in Douala. The exploration of data gathered is on course in a bid to track the other terrorists who participated in the heinous crime. This arrest is a fulfillment of the promise made on October 18, 2019 by the governor of the Northwest region, Adolf Lele Lafri, while he was in the residence of the victim's family in Bamenda, to extend the condolences and message of comfort of the head of state and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, His Excellency Paul Biya.
Ambassador docked many trenches, and the road was not passing. So, apart from the operation itself, the engineer corps opened the road to make sure that the population will move freely from Oku to Kumbo. We invite the population and tell them that you are here, the security and defense forces are here to protect them, to secure them. And then you need collaboration to succeed this operation, because you have to win hearts and minds. Those boys in the bushes, they are our boys, they are our sons. Let them come out, drop their weapons, and then all their sins will be forgiven. They will take them to DDR center in Bamenda, and nobody, if they drop their arms, will hurt them.
The population are suffering lack of road in Kumba in general, and in some quarters in particular. We are now in terms of Kumba coming from Équinoxe Tv, and you see the state of the road is very, very deplorable. It is a very, very big issue. It's not easy for the population to carry their properties to move to the hospital. It's not easy for them. But the truth is that at the local level, we are going to sit together what to do to improve the living condition of the population. That's why I am here with all the mayors concerned, Mayor of Kumba 1, Kumba 2, Kumba 3, even the city mayors. I received firm instruction from the minister. He said that they should make an evaluation of the work which is supposed to be done from Kaketu to Takli Johnson. The team in charge are going to start this exercise. What you are saying, the national road, is true, but you are the one suffering. You are the one who needs to use this particular stretch of the road. That's why at the local level we are going to see what to do while waiting for the funding from the Minister of Work.
People are not wearing their mask, and we are asking all the divisional officers, the mayors, to make an effort.
If water is not filled in this drum, I think the water head will pay 10 goat and 5 jug of palm wine and a basket of kola nut. And if you pay the first time, the second time is not there, you will double. And like I've said, if a child is sick, you need to force that child to drink medication in order to get well. COVID is real. We must do everything to protect the land, to protect this town, this beautiful town of ours.
Thanks for staying with us. Professor Henry FOMUNDAM, I've heard people saying Africans don't receive any vaccine from Europe, don't receive any vaccine from America. No vaccine trials, no vaccine testing in Africa. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I have also heard, but we're dealing in times of where the social media is rolling. The social media puts things that are not vetted, and it's because of the ignorance of a lot of people. And if you do what we've just discussed here, and educate the masses, that you have a government in place, your Ministry of Health has all the checks and balances that are required to conduct a clinical trial, then everything should be in order, which means if a trial is coming into Cameroon, you have that scientific committee that is going to look at the science of the trial. Should we admit this trial in Cameroon? And that science committee is going to be made up of your top scientists in Cameroon, epidemiologists, biostatisticians, public health practitioners, pharmaceutical care people. They will look at the science of it and say, this is a drug that, yes, we think is going to be of benefit. The science is there and we need it in our country. Then the ethics committee should be looking at things like, how do we select the patients? How do we make sure that there's informed consent? We speak to the patients in a language that they understand, that they are not forced into the study, they understand why they are there. And one of the things, to answer one of your previous questions, is that the ethics committee also ensures that the patients are insured in case something goes wrong with the patient. There are insurance companies that do just that. So, and then you have that committee that is going to monitor every study that is going on in the country. And of course, the committee that normally comes with clinical trials, which is the Pharmacovigilance or Data Safety Monitoring Board, which makes sure that you monitor for every side effect, for every adverse drug reaction. If you have all of that in place, and we inform our population, then we educate them, then I see no reason why we should be afraid, which means if the science is bad, our scientific committee is going to stop it right there. If the patient recruitment process is not proper, our ethics committee is going to say we're not comfortable and we cannot enroll our patients. If there's no monitoring of data, safety data on that, if there's no committee to do that, or no process, no protocol to do that, we're going to say this protocol is incomplete. We need to make sure that we monitor our patients to make sure that there are no untoward reactions, no major adverse drug reactions. Because normal adverse drug reactions come with every drug. If you're going to have some headache, some nausea, some vomiting, you document that those ones we can deal with, we can manage with them. But if you have a drug that is going to cause liver failure, then we shouldn't be using a drug like that in a clinical trial. And so if it comes to Cameroon, they will look at the data. The scientific committee will look at first the data that happened in animals, the data that happened in, if it was a phase 1 or phase 2, and be able to say, we've looked at the science, we've looked at what was reported before, and we're comfortable.
African health systems, or better still, African countries, ready in their present state? Are they ready for clinical trials of a COVID-19 vaccine, for example? That will be done within the ambits of the ethics and rules of the game, so to speak, that will ensure the safety, the health safety of the citizens.
Right. So, to answer that question, Jonathan, very important question, is that not all the African countries are ready. Some of the countries are at different stages of their medicine regulation. By the way, all the African countries have a medicine regulatory authority. What hampers them is the capacity that they have. the personnel to be able to do the right work. And so there are a lot of countries in Africa that are not ripe for that. But the blame should not be on the sponsor, on the person that is bringing the medication. It should be on the fact that for whatever reason, that African country has not created a clinical trial environment. And so you bring a clinical trial into the country, you're going to now depend on everything that the sponsor is bringing into the country. And it shouldn't be that way. You should have your own committees that are able to review whatever protocol is brought to you. So to answer your question, not all the African countries are ready at all. South Africa is very, very ready, and that's because I'm here. I've served on the clinical trials committee, and we even had something that you call post-trial benefit, which means your patients that are enrolled on a study, what do they gain after that in terms of if a patient was on a study for high blood pressure and the medicine works perfect for the patient and the study was a one-year study, you cannot just drop the patient and go. We expect you to continue, the patient to continue benefiting from that, which is a challenge because you're asking the sponsor to now produce medication that the patient will take on a number of years before the medication is duly registered. And so the African systems is what we should be crying foul, that all of them should come up to speed to make sure that they can create the infrastructure for clinical trials to come into the various countries.
What is required for the other African countries, including Cameroon, your home country, to be ready to receive clinical trials and ensure the safety of the people?
Well, it's the leadership, particularly at the Ministry of Health. It's the leadership prioritizing this because Cameroon is not short of scientists at all. I mean, it's a matter of creating an independent scientific committee that is able to review these protocols. And I'm sure there's one that is existing, but make sure that they have the right capacity. And there's something called good clinical practice, which is done all over the world. It's a course, a short course, for members of this committee to be able to take that course and understand what is required of all of them in the conduct of studies. Most of them would have had epidemiologists, biostatisticians, but they need to take this course to make sure that they are in line with the international norms for conducting clinical trials. And then an ethics committee is usually made up of people in the community, say a community representative, a pastor of a church. These are people who represent patients and be able to read the protocol, parts of the aspects of the protocol that pertain to patient selection, and make sure that the informed consent, which means the information that tells the patient about the clinical study that they're going to enroll in it, has language that the patient can read and understand. You don't need scientific terminology, so you can read it and say, change the word pyretic, which is fever. No, change it to fever because my patients will not understand. That's what an ethics committee does. And so in Cameroon, if we have sound and good ethics committee, a good scientific committee, the Data Safety Monitoring Board is something that a number of pharmacists will be able to enroll on it and be able to monitor the patients to make sure that you don't have any serious adverse drug reactions and be able to report that. And so these are things that are readily available. The leadership at the Ministry of Health has to be able to make sure that all of these are in place and be able to attract, you would therefore attract a lot of trials from out of the country because you have the framework. And that's what, for example, the US FDA, which regulates the medication, they don't want to study. That's why you saw NIH putting together that group. They don't want to make sure that at the end of the study, then we discover that you didn't recruit the patient very well, you didn't monitor the patient very well. You cannot use that kind of information to register medication. So that's counterproductive. I think Cameroon has the expertise. The leadership just needs to make sure that all of these things are put in place.
Beyond clinical trials, what is the state of the capacity of African health systems to respond to health challenges, public health challenges like the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, the capacity is the weakest compared to other continents. It's the weakest in terms of, again, the infrastructure, the leadership, the human resources, the commodity management that we find. It's the weakest, and all of these areas have a lot of challenges. One that we haven't spoken about is the commodity management, for example, which means what kind of medications are entering into your country, for example. Because when the COVID-19 treatment becomes available, guess what is going to happen? We'll start finding counterfeit medications, just like we find for many things, including HIV medication. This is the continent which is the home for counterfeit medicines in the world. If anybody is trying to fake medicines, make counterfeit medicine, the market that they are thinking about is the African market, because the regulatory authorities are not capacitated, the corruption is very high, most of the borders are very porous, and so there's a lot of counterfeit medicine that is floating in Cameroon and other African countries. So that counterfeit basically means you're giving substandard medicines to the patient. Some of them may not have all of the ingredient, some of them have zero ingredient in it. So imagine you have a pneumonia and they give you an antibiotic and you find out that there's zero ingredient in it, which means you're not touching the bacteria in any way. The only thing that you're gaining from there is perhaps a side effect that you're going to get. And so these are the challenges that we face on the continent.
What about personnel? The personnel, training, and equipment.
Right. And the issues of personnel, again, we have some good medical schools, not nearly enough. This continent trains the least number of doctors, the least number of nurses, the least number of pharmacists, yet the European and American countries poach from here. It's something that you call brain drain. And so you have a situation where a number of we have very few doctors for so many patients. And so the quality of care is going to be very bad. The equipment part of it, you're going to see that modern equipment, MRI, CAT scan, they're only in a few hospitals in Cameroon. That's part of the routine practice. Yes, they're expensive, but at the end of the day, it's very cost effective because you're going to have patients die because you don't have the equipment in place. And so these are things that the government and other people should have to be focusing on. So in terms of that equipment, you don't find it. And then the practice, the guidelines, the monitoring. Patients in Cameroon, for example, almost all the patients, the injections that people receive in Cameroon, what people call drips when they go to the hospital, most of them are really unwanted. Because if a lot of patients feel like if you're not on a drip, it means you're not getting treatment. Because patients have not been educated. A drip usually means you can have what they call nosocomial infection, which means in the process of giving you a drip, because the environment was not clean, you end up with an infection. And so there are lots of tablets and medications that we've studied. They are very equivalent to the drips that people take. And these are things that need to be enforced in guidelines. The infrastructure in most African countries, including Cameroon, is very weak. Patients should not be living more than 15 kilometers from a clinic, from a functioning clinic, not just a clinic with no medications, no doctors, no nurses, and things like that. That's the general recommendation. And then going back to, you have spoken about human resources. The last time I told you that, take, for example, the pharmacist. It's one pharmacist to 2,300 patients. That's not the ratio that you find in Cameroon. I don't know what the exact ratio is, but I can give you a country where I visited a couple of months ago. In Malawi, it's one pharmacist to 400,000 patients, 450,000 patients, instead of 1 to 2,300 patients. That's the kind of healthcare that we have on the continent. So we have to do something to retain the healthcare workers that we have on this continent, in Cameroon, and on the continent. You cannot have a situation where the doctors are leaving and the healthcare workers are leaving.
We have to do something, you said. So what should be done? If you were in a position to advise the health ministers, the health officials in the different African countries, in some few words, what should be done?
Well, there are a number of things that you can do. During their training, and I'm sure in QS is the same thing, they need to sign a contract because all their studies is subsidized by the government. You need to sign a contract and follow up with them. You need to make sure that they are also compensated very well, they are paid very well, and then most of them want to work in Yaoundé and Douala. There are no doctors in the rural areas. In this country, in South Africa, we have what you call the rural allowances. So you send them there and increase their salary, because you understand why they're refusing to go into Nkambe and things like that. There are no amenities. So if you can compensate them with some kind of allowance, they will be able to go. So there are a number of measures that we can put in place to make sure that people are not leaving. It's a human rights thing. You cannot force anybody to stay, but you can give them incentive to stay.
Professor Henry FOMUNDAM is one of the great Cameroonian minds on the diaspora. He is a pharmaceutical care and public health expert who has been working in the areas of academia and public health programs in many African countries for several years. Thanks, Professor, for joining us in this edition of The Insight.
Indeed, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thanks for staying with us, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for today. Goodbye.